Moving on to the second 25 mark question, let's have a read of this. So, evaluate possible methods, so it's asking about methods of government intervention to reduce carbon emissions caused by road transport in the UK. Now, for those of you who have done lots of past papers, who have done lots of essays, this question is very similar to previous questions. And what does this question link to? This question links a lot to previous questions, and it's very similar to previous questions on market failure / like government failure. So that type of topic area, so market failure, government intervention. Of course, it mentions government intervention in the question, but it's basically asking you. Essentially, all the question is policies to solve market failure, and they are very easy, and of course we've learned lots of them. And if you break the question down in smaller chunks, it's talking about carbon emissions, road transport in the UK, and all of these cause negative externalities. So definitely for one of the paragraphs, I would probably write about tax, and then maybe throw in a negative externality diagram, mention a bit of market failure theory in as well, since it's definitely relevant. But just in general, with 25 marker technique, a classic thing students ask me is they'll read a question and their mind will go blank. How do you solve that? Lots of students will literally have the A-style content knowledge where they'll know everything, but still their mind will go blank. And this is why, of course, I always say economics is a double-edged sword. You need your content knowledge you need mastery of content knowledge, but also you need mastery of exam technique to get that A and A star. But, so you're reading the 25 marker, you go blank. What do? The main thing you need to do is try link it to a topic area. So link it to the big topics in economics you've learned. Try link it to maybe market failure, market structure, so like monopolies, labour markets, whatever it links to, just try link it to a big topic area. Then once you've managed to link it to a topic area, then you can go about thinking about maybe your notes in that topic area, maybe some revision you've done in that topic area, and slowly ideas should pop in your mind. But definitely with the exam pressure and on exam day, you should actually be expecting that when you read some questions, your mind should go blank. You need to prepare for the worst basically, and if it does happen, just use that strategy, link it to topic areas, and slowly the ideas will come flooding in, and then you can go about writing. Okay, so like I said, this is an absolute classic question, and let's just try plan some of the points we can mention. So number one, 100%, if we're talking about trying to reduce the carbon emissions, what is the main strategy you kind of learned with policies to reduce something, maybe reduce consumption, maybe reduce production or something. And the main policy, the first policy that should pop into your mind from your content knowledge is an indirect or just a tax. So you're probably going to do a tax on producers, maybe when producers sell the car or when producers produce new diesel or petrol cars, since of course there is the diesel and petrol cars which do release emissions. And what is a tax trying to do? We're trying to incentivize these producers to stop producing petrol and diesel cars and move towards maybe electric car production, since electric cars are better for carbon emissions. But of course that is an evaluation in itself. Of course, electric vehicles, the batteries, they have massive carbon footprints, like absolute massive carbon footprints, and that works as a really good evaluation point, saying that we're trying to incentivize the production of electric vehicles, but it depends on whether electric vehicles are actually that much more sustainable, that much more efficient in terms of carbon emissions than petrol and diesel vehicles. So let's try to just plan some of the policies we would use. So what is the first policy in the main paragraph I believe you should write? So essentially the question is asking us, how can the government reduce the production of carbon emissions? So one of the ways we're going to do that is reduce the production of cars. What is a big way we can do that? Using prices, and your big first paragraph should be taxes, and if you want to be more specific, an indirect tax. Why? How could we use this? Since to reduce carbon emissions, we probably the best case scenario. We haven't actually read the stimulus yet, so this mentioned. What did this actually mention? A petrol car journey from London to Glasgow is 3.3 times more carbon dioxide than by train. But anyway, so if we're indirect taxing, what we're going to do, we're probably going to tax the production of diesel and petrol cars. Why? So what is a tax going to do? If we tax the producers, it's going to increase the cost of production of these diesel and petrol cars. And why will that help reduce carbon emissions? You could say it incentivizes people to buy electric cars, since if diesel and petrol cars are more expensive now, of course electric cars is a substitute. Individuals may substitute away from diesel and petrol cars to electric cars, or producers may just simply stop producing petrol and diesel cars since they're too expensive and just stop producing electric cars. But a great thing to mention with electric cars, and this is just real world application, electric cars themselves, although I think they don't release carbon or carbon dioxide, but they have a massive carbon footprint. They were in the process of making the battery, transporting these massive electrical batteries. They have a massive carbon footprint. So you can also mention the effectiveness of whether we're actually reaching our goal. So our goal is to reduce carbon emissions, but are electric vehicles actually that much more efficient in terms of carbon emissions than petrol and diesel vehicles, since the carbon footprint is so large? And this is just all real world application. It's just like reading the news. I wouldn't particularly suggest students to read the news, since there's a lot of waffle that you won't remember, but just making sure, especially I emphasize it in live classes, make sure if your teacher's teaching, he's including as much application as is just necessary, and it works really well for evaluation. So what would I mention in my tax paragraph? So the first thing and the big thing, and the main thing that's going to drive my chain of analysis, assist me in the chain of analysis, and this is how you need to think of diagrams. If you can use a diagram, it is perfect. Why? Because it just helps you. A lot of students struggle with the length of the chain of analysis, making the chain of analysis step by step. But if you can include a diagram, it makes it, I'd say, like 50% easier. But then it's about having that diagram mastery. This is where in your revision, you need to really strive to understand what the diagram means. You should know every little bit of the diagram. So, for example, in this, we're going to draw a negative externality diagram. So supply equals MPC. You shouldn't just learn the diagram just knowing that it's the supply equals MPC. You should know what marginal private cost actually means and the backstory almost behind it. And that, just learning, if you just want to do it for the main diagrams, just learning what these things actually mean is going to boost your grade, and it's going to make that chain of analysis move from a simple band 2, band 3 chain of analysis to that top level band 4 and band 5 chains of analysis. But yeah, so we're just going to draw a negative production externality diagram. So like I said, supply equals marginal private cost. I have not actually labeled my axis. Demand equals marginal private benefit equals marginal social benefit. And obviously cost slash benefit on this axis, quantity on this axis, and then we have marginal social cost curve, which is obviously above our marginal private cost curve. And how would we show a tax on this diagram? You can do it very simply by just putting a comma there and putting MPC plus tax, since this is of course the perfect size for the tax. Why? Because now the producers are operating at a socially efficient equilibrium. Let's label that on. So what would this equilibrium be? This would of course be the market equilibrium at QE, and then we have where MSC intersects MSB. This is now the socially efficient equilibrium at this point, which is just to label on. That is a socially efficient equilibrium, and the blue point is the market equilibrium. Last few things to label on, just label on the triangle of welfare loss. Of course, how do you work that out? We go from a market equilibrium where supply equals demand, so this blue point here, and you go up or down to the social curve, and the social curve is up in this scenario, so you would just go straight up, and that is your welfare loss. And other thing to label is just the bottom of the diagram, just the difference in QSE and QE is the overproduction. Okay, so how would I actually now use this diagram in my chain of analysis? So let's go about it. So of course, simple normal paragraph structure, A-star paragraph structure video, very good one. Go and watch it if you haven't. But what is the paragraph structure? It's point, application, analysis, link back to question. So it's basically KA paragraph structure, and then at the end you link back to the question. But so I would say one method of government intervention to reduce carbon emissions caused by road transport in the UK. You should be picking up here. What am I doing? I'm reusing literally every single word from the question. One thing examiners will say in examiners' reports, or just say on students' scripts, is that they're not directly answering the question. How do you solve that? You literally use the exact wording from the question and address the question directly, so you can never get that mark or never get marked down for that reason. So one method of government intervention to reduce carbon emissions is by the government setting an indirect tax on producers. Then I would move on to application, saying something like, in the UK, there is a 52 pence per litre of petrol or diesel tax. And that is literally how simple real world application is. You just need to mention a stat is always the best. And I really do try to go through as many of these as possible in my live classes, because it's so important, and you can almost build like a little fact file of just these stats when I go through them. But so 52 pence per litre is tax, and then I would move on to my chains of analysis. So this part of my paragraph. So then I would probably start by just mentioning that producers before the tax, they start at the market equilibrium. Of course, at the market equilibrium, we are producing at QE. Why is that? Since in the free market, producers only think about their private costs, and not external costs. Thus, they overproduce. So they produce at quantity QE, which is of course not at the socially efficient production quantity. Therefore, the government have to intervene. They have to set a tax. So they intervene with MPC plus tax. What does that lead to? It means that by setting a tax, by increasing the producer's private cost of production, it means the overproduction is no longer happening. We are producing at QSE instead of QE, and since there's no longer any overproduction, it means the welfare loss to society, the deadweight loss to society, is no longer happening. As then you can talk about prices. As prices increase from PE to P1, or the cost to producers increase to PE to P1, this could mean these producers could relay these costs onto consumers, so that they could pass these costs onto consumers. Thus, of course, like we were saying, if there's higher costs for petrol and diesel cars, it will incentivize consumers to find other avenues, such as electric vehicles or even public transport. So instead of taking a car to work, they might start taking a train to work. And then you can link in this part of the stimulus, saying that E.G. trains are 3.3 times less carbon emissions than a car. So yeah, basically just explaining the diagram a bit, then explaining why the tax works. The tax, you just explain that incentivizes individuals to find other methods of transport, thus reducing the number of admissions, or the quantity of admissions, and that overall achieves the government's goal of reducing carbon emissions. So just that last bit there, mentioning thus overall reaching the government's goal of reducing carbon emissions, that is linking back to the question. The reason why I suggest students do this, one of the biggest problems students have year on year, I've seen it with experience, is students waffle. They start going on tangents, speaking about random things, but always, if you're writing your chain of analysis, and in the back of your mind, if you're always you're always thinking about, okay, I need to eventually link this back to the question, it will stop you going off track, and it'll keep you focused on the question. Since remember, you can write the best economics theory, if it's not to do the question, you won't be picking up any marks. Okay, so moving on to the 9 marks of evaluation you have in your 25 mark question. I am going to go through it quite briefly. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to go through evaluation a bit more in depth, since I feel like well, of course, for me, evaluation is quite simple because I've been teaching this for how many years. But let me know, since a lot of students struggle with evaluation. So if I do get a few comments, I will start making the evaluation a bit more in detail to help you guys out. But how would I evaluate this? So like I said before, what we mentioned, the first point, is just the carbon footprint of electric cars is, of course, absolutely massive. So that means that you can link that to government failure. Why is that government failure? The government have intervened in the market to try and reduce the carbon emissions. However, in reality, it's not a great policy, is it? Since because we're trying to incentivize electric vehicles, but if electric vehicles also have a massive carbon footprint, have massive carbon emissions, it's an example of government failure. Why? Because the government have intervened in the market to try improve the allocation of resources, so improve the carbon emissions, but in reality, they haven't particularly solved it. They haven't internalized the negative externality, you can say. And then of course, just the size of the tax. Because the government does not have perfect information on the market, they may set the tax. Okay, so that is the indirect tax paragraph done. But for this question, there are absolutely loads of possibilities and different ways you can. Answer the question. So let's try to think of some more. So basically, methods of government intervention to reduce carbon emissions. So other ones include. So I'm just going to write policies. Other ones include, of course, subsidies. So whatever way you want to subsidise. Maybe you want to subsidise new electric vehicles. Maybe even you want to subsidise public transport. So whatever you want to subsidise, since if you subsidise public transport, again, due to the inverse relationship of demand, when prices fall, quantity demanded increases. Why? Because it incentivises producers to substitute away, since public transport, electric vehicles, petrol, diesel vehicles, so fueled power vehicles, they are all substitutes of each other. So yeah, subsidies is definitely one. I'm not going to go into depth with the paragraph on subsidies, since literally in the last question we just covered the entire chain of analysis for subsidies. I will just do the same thing. Consumer producer surplus, make sure you include it on the subsidy diagram, as it just elevates this from a normal year 12 diagram to a really top level year 13A star diagram. And of course, just as very brief, subsidy, what does it do? Shift the supply curve out to S plus sub, increases quantity produced and decreases the price. Then you'd mention how there's an increase in consumer and producer surplus, and yeah, just go from there. And evaluations, of course, it depends whether producers respond to the subsidy, opportunity cost of subsidy, and a few more. Okay, and other great policy Okay, another great policy we can use for this question is deregulation. What does deregulation mean? Deregulation, of course, in this scenario would mean in the car industry we reduce legislation. We basically make it easier. We reduce the barriers to entry to enter the car industry market. So the production of cars. Why would this help our goal of reducing carbon emissions? As if you reduce that regulation, it's going to lead to, if you reduce the barriers to entry, it's going to be easier for new entrants, new firms to enter the market. This will therefore increase competition in the market. And when there's more competition in the market, there's more firms in the market, it can definitely lead to innovation. It can lead to the incumbent firms being forced to innovate to maintain their market share, or the new firms just coming in and changing up the market, bringing a new like taste to the market. But by new firms coming into the market, it can lead to investment into these electric cars, into these electric vehicles, thus meaning it's a double positive for the government. Why? Firstly, with something like subsidies, of course, it's going to cost the government to intervene. Something like taxes is still admin costs for the government to intervene, and it can lead to government failure since the government is intervening in the market itself. Whereas, if we think about deregulation, we can class this as a market-based supply-side policy. Since why? Since with deregulation, the government is actually decreasing their intervention in the market. So they have less control of the market. So therefore it reduces the likelihood of government failure occurring, since they are actually, instead of increasing their intervention in the market, they're decreasing their intervention in the market. And with regards to evaluation of deregulation, a great evaluation and a complete polar opposite would of course be just regulation. So however, in evaluation, this depends on whether regulation by, for example, the CMA would be a more effective policy. As maybe the CMA could regulate these car industry producers to stop overcharging maybe for the electric vehicles, or it could regulate public transport. Maybe the trams, the trains, the buses are overcharging consumers. So therefore regulation may actually be a better policy than deregulation. So it's almost in evaluation there, you're almost weighing up your argument. And it's really good since in these policy questions, since we're presenting a policy, a great evaluation is actually just presenting another policy that works on the negatives of the policy you presented, that improves on the negatives of the policy you presented. Also, since the majority of the UK population, it's very likely that you watching this are from London. London, of course, have ULEZ, so that is a good bit of application you can include whenever you're thinking about carbon emissions, anything to do with cars. And then some more policies, like, of course, you can do the classic ones, min plus maximum prices. They would, of course, work well here. And like I always say, if you're drawing these diagrams, don't just keep them the simple classic diagram like this. Add in the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, and the where the deadweight welfare loss is, as it just upgrades that diagram, gives you a bit more to speak about in that chain of analysis, thus allowing you to reach those higher levels. And with regards to valuation, I've actually been mentioning quite a lot that they're all substitutes. That public transport, cars, petrol cars, electric cars are all substitutes. But you could 100%, whenever we talk about substitutes, you could discuss the value of the XCD, whether they are strong substitutes or whether they are weaker substitutes. Then, of course, another valuation is time frame. Also, petrol, diesel, it's not a renewable source. So instead of the government intervening, maybe the market itself, and this is a really good evaluation, the market itself maybe is able to solve the market failure. Why? Since petrol and diesel, they're running out the non-renewable resources, and this will force the market to innovate. It will force producers to stop allocating more resources towards electric vehicles. Therefore, in the long run, the government does not actually have to intervene, since the market itself will solve the failure of using petrol and diesel cars. But yeah, like you can probably tell, and I've only mentioned probably 40% of the points, there are an absolute abundance of points here. But again, do not try to get too overwhelmed with the variety of points. Pick your points, whether it's tax, subsidies. If that's your 2 paragraphs, focus on them. In your final judgment, you can throw in things like deregulation, maximum minimum prices, but focus on your points. Of course, step-by-step chain analysis, break everything down, and yeah, that should be more than enough. And this is a really, really good question. And if you get something like this in your exam, you should be chuffed, because this is a very nice one. And you can 100%, if you've done your practice, score 20 plus, score anywhere around 25 on this. Okay, so what are the main takeaways from this paper? Firstly, just like your content knowledge needs to be solid. Of course, that is quite general advice, but for example, I believe we got, if I remember correctly, you did get examined on things like XCD here. That is it's quite niche, to be honest, but just make sure for your section A especially, make sure you've got those bits revised. And then if I do this every time, I can say this every single time, make sure you're solid on your application. It's just it's a cornerstone of your grade, and you need to make sure you are learning it somehow. And a really good way, join the live classes. We do teach a heck of a lot of application. But yeah, that is 2023 paper 1 done.